Okay. Sorry, just a moment. I want to hide the video panel for the okay, yes, perfect. So, well, okay. Well, let's say first of all that the prevention of obesity is a long route, and it's a long route involving many different steps, and we will see in deeper details some of them, especially those where we have a role in changing it or in modifying it at least. And in this long route, every age has its importance, and there are many different reasons that may justify every action we can take to enhance the effectiveness of prevention. But if we had to talk about prevention at all pediatric ages, as it was intended at the beginning of the organization of the meeting, this would take too much time and we couldn't enter into details, so it would be something I thought not very useful to the audience. And this is why I decided to focus only on the very first age of our life, that is infancy. But even in infancy, there are at least two different steps, and both of them together are considered or have been considered by a big person of these studies, Irene Axelsson, as the only two real revolution in our nutritional life. And the two revolutionary moments are birth and breastfeeding, because it is the moment when we change our way of feeding from intravenous, I mean through the umbilical cord, to a real eating through our mouth and digestive system. And the second revolutionary moment is the weaning. Why? Because it is the only moment in our life when we change from eating just one thing, one food, which is milk, to a differentiated diet. There is no other moment during our life when this happens. So this is why Irene Axelsson considers these two moments as the only two real revolutions. Now, going back on which role we can have in preventing obesity, well, there are, as you have seen in the first slide, several different steps. The first step is obviously genetics. Well, we don't have any role in it unless we choose the perfect couple of parents, but this is impossible to do in advance, of course, and even after, I mean. Then there is the epigenetics, and we are learning a lot about it, but we don't have a real role in changing our personal epigenetics. Our parents and grandparents have a role. We may have it, but only for the next generations, not for ourselves. Then there is a big part environment. And environment, one could say, yes, we have control on what happens around us. But this is not completely true. And then there is the last step, at least according to my point of view, which is the nutritional education. And that one is totally up to us, even though we may need some coaching in it. Let's see first the issue with environment. Environment is made of several different, it's like a puzzle made of different pieces. And for some of them, we have really a role. We may have a role if we want to change things. And while changing, for instance, the nutritional styles, the personal hygiene, and some other points, we may have a minor role or even in changing our intestinal microbiota. But then some other things are not under our control, or at least not at all, not completely, like working habits, the family we have, the peer group, and so on. We can change something in it, but not everything. And then there is another bigger part, mass media, marketing influence, the lack of intervention or the intervention by stakeholders, and those parts are not under our control. Why we can't really have the environment under total control? Because environment is made of different parts. There is an individual part, which is really under our control, but then we have another part which includes work, school, and home, where the influence of our decisions can be good or less good, sometimes depending on us, some other times out of our control. The communities is the third part of the environment, and since we are going farther away from our personal being, then the influence we can have on the subsequent parts is less and less important. So then, according to this point of view, you have at national and state level where our influence is almost null, and the international factors, of course, are completely out of our control, unless we are some of the biggest persons in the world. So let's go back to what is under our real control, if we only want it, which is the nutritional education. And the nutritional education doesn't come out of nowhere. Partly it is an innate process which shows anyway the effects of previous experiences and the cognitive development each of us has reached at that moment of our life. And it is partly learned, even though not always, sadly, through the right channels, as you can see. And keeping this in mind, when can we start a child's nutritional education? There is an old adage saying that the good day starts in the morning. And so this is the main reason why I started thinking of the breastfeeding as a focusing point of the child nutritional education. Of course, this process will be reinforced and widened during the time when the complementary feeding, which was once called weaning, but now in a more politically correct way is called complementary feeding, starts. Well, it might seem quite strange to consider breastfeeding as a major tool of nutritional education of the child, but if you think deeply of it, you can understand quite easily why. Because breastfeeding can represent, I stressed can represent, because it is not obvious, nor it happens continuously, but it can represent the most correct and important feeding style, and it can play a major role in terms of prevention of obesity, under certain conditions, of course. It is a common and widely shared opinion that breastfeeding protects from obesity, and the same WHO consider this point as very important one. And possible reasons are that in a correct breastfeeding, there is a likewise correct synchronization between needs for the child to be fed and rates of feeding decided or partly decided by the mother. And this can influence positively future nutritional styles. Well, speaking of synchronization, This slide is not strictly connected to our topic, so you can skip it, and if you want, you can sleep for 1 minute. But anyway, a correct breastfeeding practice where the mother really is listening to her baby's request may influence positively even the development of language. And this question is an old one and was first raised by Broad and co-workers in 3 different studies in the 70s and 80s. And all these studies reported that formula-fed children were more likely to experience slower communicative development than breastfed infants. But anyway, we go back to our prevention and nutritional prevention. And Benjamin Franklin was used to saying that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But we have to be careful, because when we speak of prevention, we cannot limit to nutritional aspects. We must always think to nurturing aspects too. And there is a difference. This is what I used to tell my students to make the concept clear enough. You feed your baby through his mouth and stomach, but you nurture him with your heart and your mind. So there are 2 different ways of feeding the baby, and 2 different consequences in terms of prevention. As for the nurturing aspects of breastfeeding, we said that breastfeeding practice can represent the most correct and important feeding style. But as long as the mother is made able to understand, to accept, to favor, but also to steer in the most proper way her child's rhythms. And as long as a correct caring is not confused with the exclusive satisfaction of hunger, or whatever is thought to be hunger. Why? Well, first of all, the most common issue is a very typical one, and it is very understandable too. Mothers, very often, especially if they are with their first baby, become anxious. They don't know exactly if their milk is of good quality, if they produce enough milk, if babies are really satisfied, and so on. If you add to these issues a very dangerous advice, you have a really explosive mixture. I'm saying so because mothers are sometimes, well, I would say quite often, unfortunately, improperly advised. Let's see what is one of the main advice they get even before the birth of the baby. They are said that whenever the baby cries, you give him or her your breast. Well, it looks like being quite a good thing to say, a good advice, but this implies that the mother won't be trying to understand what the baby is saying, but she interprets, and more often misinterprets, what the baby is saying. Let me make some example of it. The baby is saying, have a tummy ache. Well, and the mother is answering, eat. The baby is saying, I'm wet. And the answer again is, well, take my breast, eat. The baby is asking for some petting, and the mother is replying with, eat. So since the verbal messages are always more effective than the verbal ones, sorry, the non-verbal messages are more effective than the verbal ones, this can be really dangerous when regarded in perspective, because what the baby, the infant, is learning is that whenever and for whatever reason I feel stressed, food will be the right solution for me. Then, finally, a more proper advice would rather sound a little bit different than the original one, just adding 2 or 3 three in English case, three simple words. Whenever the baby cries out of anger, you give him your breast. So the response of the mother must be an appropriate one, can't be a general one, valid, whatever is happening. But as I said, there is a nurturing aspect and there is a nutritional aspect. And some nutritional properties of human milk might help to prevent obesity, because human milk has little quantity of proteins, only 6% of energy comes from proteins, and a lot of fats. Most of them are unsaturated fatty acids, around 80%, versus a little bit of saturated fatty acids, only around 20%. It has also 3 times more cholesterol than cow's milk. And the combination of richness in fats and cholesterol and the slow decline in fat intakes during weaning, together with a small content of saturated fatty acids, is what probably teaches the body, through the epigenetic mechanism, how to manage the triglycerides metabolism. What else? Human milk, we have said, has a little quantities of protein, so the protein intake will be low. And besides, these proteins have also a very little quantity of insulinogenic amino acids, so they are not pushing on the production of insulin and IGF-1, as well as on the production of body fat. What else? Besides these unique properties, human milk gives the baby a better ability to self-regulate its consumption, thanks to the presence of high level of leptin and low levels of ghrelin and again of IGF-1. So there is not induction in the appetite. And there is high fat content, which induces a sense of satisfaction about the meal they have just assumed. There is again a reduced caloric intake, only 67 kilocalories per deciliter, and there are also bioactive factors inhibiting differentiation of adipocytes, at least in vitro, but it's probably happening also in vivo, like epidermal growth factor and tumor necrosis factor alpha. As a result, there will be a protective effect on the subsequent development of both obesity and these metabolic diseases in adult age. And this is happening even in children that had a high birth weight. The effects, besides, looks like being strictly related to the duration of breastfeeding. So it is not only the fact that the child is breastfed, but for how long it has been breastfed. Again, there is something really new concerning the properties of human milk. In very recent years, it has been found that the human milk is not sterile. It contains a lot of microbiota, and its microbiome comes from 50 different genera distributed in 9 prevalent groups for a total of more than 800 microbial species. The most represented species are usually proteobacteria and firmicutes, which is quite a paradox because the least abundant and common are bifidobacteria and lactobacilli, exactly the opposite of what we know is happening in breastfed babies. Another important point is that the quantity of these microbial species is not a small one. the baby receives from 100,000 up to 10 million of bacteria per day. So quite a big quantity. Yes, it is just a drop in this in the sea of our intestinal microbiota, but it is a big quantity anyway. And it has already been proved that human milk microbiota is a stable one. Each woman tends to have the same microbiota along her life, and of course along the breastfeeding period. Well, the bacteria come from the bacterial enteromammary pathway, so they go from the dendritic cells of the intestine to the mesenteric lymph nodes. They can survive there for several days, and from the lymph nodes they go to the mammary gland and are excreted in the milk. But there are differences that has already been found among the different weaning. For instance, it differs according to the mode of delivery. In the emergency cesarean section, it is similar to the vaginal delivery, but it is different from what happens in the programmed cesarean section. So since there are stress hormones involved in these three different ways of delivering, it is possible that the effect of stress hormones also acts on the composition of the microbiota in the breast milk. Most importantly, the microbiota differs in obese women and in non-obese ones, which means that it may affect the intestinal microbiota composition in infants. And if this is true, and this is clearly proven, it is not yet, but there are several hints that it can be true, and then it might modify the epigenetic susceptibility to the obesity. Just some words about weaning. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because, again, it is a big chapter in the life of the baby, and it would take too much time. But it is important to remember that a wrong weaning may contribute to future obesity. If the quantity of proteins is high during weaning, you must remind, we are coming from a feeding way where proteins only accounted for 6% of the total daily energy. Then if you switch to a high level of proteins, then you'll have a push on the IGF-1 production, which in turn will push the differentiation of the pre-adipocytes. So there will be an easier accumulation of fats in following age when the fats will come from hyperlipidic and hyperglycemic diets. It has been seen that dairy proteins have a heavier effect on the future obesity. Probably because they have a higher quantities of insulinogenic amino acids, but also because we are using much more milk than meat, fish, and eggs in this period of the life. And even though meat, fish, and eggs have more proteins in them, the global quantity is so little that the milk is the most dangerous. Well, milk and the derivatives, so the dairy protein, dairy products, are to be considered like more dangerous than the other kind of foods. Protein intake at 2 years of age have an effect on the adiposity rebound. If at 2 years more than 16% of energy, of the daily energy, comes from proteins, then it is very likely to have an early adiposity rebound. And an early adiposity rebound is surely bounded to future development of obesity. it has been proved very well in the past that the risk of an excessive intake of protein starts well before the age of 2, and the higher the protein intake at 9, 12 months of age, the higher will be the BMI at 6 years of age, even if the total energy intake is the same during the day. So it is really related to the quantity of proteins in the nutrition of the infant, and not only because it is a bigger quantity. And the same results were derived from the CHOP study, which is a very big European one in the past. So we can say that the history of obesity starts very early if we have a wrong breastfeeding and if we have a wrong weaning time. Keeping in mind all of this, a correct weaning should use this period of time to introduce correct nutritional styles, and also to favor the acquisition of correct rules, both in nutrition and in behaviors. Correct rhythm of meals, respect of hunger, and respect of the lack of it, because the infant is not different from us, and any adult experiences some days of more hunger and some other days with less. Also, the repeated offer at later moments of foods that are not being immediately appreciated by the child is a very important part of the process in order to induce a correct approach to the nutrition in the future. Well, what we can say as a general rule is that parents know how much is the right quantity of food. I mean, parents with the help of pediatricians, parents with the help of medical figures who are experienced in the nutrition field, but is the child who knows how much of the food he wants to eat. So not pushing on finishing the plate is another very important point to make sure that the weaning is made in a correct way. My conclusions. If the struggle against obesity starts from a prolonged breastfeeding and a correct weaning, then we can recognize the favoring action of programming and of epigenetics, and envisage at least 2 kinds of action which are useful to reinforce the struggle. The promotion to cure of breastfeeding, first of all, and the guidance and monitoring of the most correct feeding practice. Let me finish with a sentence by Sir Winston Churchill, which is very appropriate to our topic. There is no finer investment for any community than putting milk into babies. Thanks a lot.